Professor Rachel Manekin is a very fresh professor emerita of Jewish studies at the University of Maryland, and also a friend. Her area of specialization is the social, political, and cultural history of Galicia and Jewry. She is the author of The Jews of Galicia and the Austrian Constitution. We saw the cover before. The beginning of modern Jewish politics. It was published in 2015. And the Rebellion of the Daughters, Jewish Women Runaways in Habsburg Galicia, that was published in Princeton University Press in 2020, which was a finalist for the 2020 National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies. And maybe this is a connection between the book and the title of this day's presentation, Modernization and Galician Jewry, Gendered Perspective. Rachel, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Okay, when considering the modernization of Galician Jewry, scholars have focused on the entry of Jews into politics, so I'm glad when I wrote it, I didn't know that you'll have this talk, on cultural development, new professional opportunities, and new religious ideologies. Jewish women are rarely included in this consideration for obvious reasons. Legally barred from being members of political associations, women were also deprived of the franchise in general. Like the non-Jewish members of their gender, Jewish women were accepted to university as regular students only starting in 1897, and lacking a formal religious education and subject to Jewish patriarchy, they were traditionally marginal in the public practices of the Jewish religion and its institutions. Economic opportunities for most Jewish women were limited to the service sector, shopkeeping, and the domestic domain, and starting in the last quarter of the 19th century, also to the teaching profession. Still, the compulsory education law of 1869 and its 1873 Galician version opened the world of Polish language and culture to many young Jewish women, and some of them continued their studies in post-primary school and universities. They certainly could be considered modern Jewish women, yet their Polish acculturation was often viewed, especially in Jewish nationalist circles, and Josh, you talked about it in general, as an embrace of Polish assimilation and as irrelevant to the question of Jewish modernity. I'm aware of only two classical private Jewish gymnasia, one for women, Goldblatt, Kamerling, private, as I said, gymnasia, which opened in 1899 in Lviv, and the mixed-gender Hebrew Gymnasium in Krakow in 1918. Nevertheless, in any discussion of Jewish modernization in Galicia, we would do well to consider the variegated experiences of Jewish women during the last period of Habsburg Galicia and in the Galician regions of the Second Polish Republic. In my talk, I will point out a few areas where research is in the incipient stage, a few more than others, and I will focus on those phenomena that bear the hallmark of modernity, especially in the secular sphere, although, as I have noted elsewhere, and we'll have a talk by Iris Brown later, tomorrow, these phenomena influence similar ones in the Orthodox sphere. If the entry into politics is one of the hallmarks of modernity, then where were the women? In his 1958 two-volume history of the Zionist movement, Nathan Michael Gelber has a brief mention of Rosa Meltzer, née Pomeranz, and the Zionist Women Association she established. More about her and this association has been published in the German language by Dietlind Hürter and Angelique Leszczawski-Szwerk, and I just heard from Eugenia about the Polish volume. Still, much remains to be done in this area, especially on the many Zionist women associations named Ruth, Miriam, Hannah, Leah, Rachela, Judith, and so on, their activities and their members. In the first decades of the 20th century, there were 28 Zionist women associations in Eastern Galicia and 3 in Western Galicia, in addition to some mixed gender associations. Articles about the establishment of women's association were written about in the Zionist newspaper, Galician Zionist newspaper, Zchut and Przyszłość, as well as in Die Welt, with some of them containing information about the number of members and names of the local leaders. These associations were primarily cultural and educational, although, as I mentioned earlier, women were legally barred from associations defined in their statutes. As political, Zionist women established associations promoting the Zionist ideology. In doing that, they provided young women a sphere of activity beyond the traditional charity activities. The highest female ideal promoted by Galician Zionist activities, as reflected in the different articles in the Zionist press, was that of mother and educator of the young. This, as I'll show later, will change, for the national cause. As Meltzer Pomeratz wrote in one of her articles, and I quote, "Should the Jewish mother of today dare to bring up her children in a non-denominational and international way, just for the service of general ideals of humanity and progress? May she overlook the horrible, bloody phenomenon of our time, which is called the Jewish question, with all the resulting horrors, and keep quiet about it from herself and from those of whom she bears the greatest responsibility? Can she overlook the fact that she, whether German, French, Polish, whether socialist, women rights activist, liberal, progressive, always remains the Jew for the others, and that those others determine her fate as long as she wouldn't do it herself as a Jew and only as a Jew," unquote. Another Zionist activist, Marta Ber Issachar from Lviv, emphasized that, and I quote, "The Jewish woman doesn't fight for women's rights, but strives with moral seriousness for women's duties." Both women during this period were less interested in the question of rights of women, as I said, it will change later, and in the duties of Jewish women to their nation. It should be noted that all women's associations in Galicia were divided across ethno-religious lines. So in this regard, the Zionist Women's Association were not an anomaly. There were some cases of Jewish women participating in Polish feminist associations like the Association for Working Women in Stri. This was opposed by some Polish women, and indeed a parallel association were established there for Polish women only, although the ethnically mixed association was not dissolved. Criticism against participation in ethnically mixed women's association or Jewish women's associations that were not focused on national aims was voiced by Galician Zionists. They accused them of promoting assimilation and of being afraid of appearing too Jewish. The Zionist Women's Association were not independent. They functioned under the umbrella of the General Zionist Organization dominated by men, which was resented by some Galician women. But unlike Polish and Ruthenian Women's Association, Zionist Women's Association did not join the general feminist fight for equality of women in education or in the franchise, but rather limited their activities to Jewish issues. Also, unlike the Galician, Polish, and Ruthenian Association, they did not establish a women's newspaper, except a short-lived Yiddish newspaper in 1918 that appeared in Krakow, Jüdische Feuerwelt. The image of some of the Women's Zionist Association has been colored by literary treatments, as for example in Agnon, so we always return to Agnon, in his satire B'Ne'areinu U'V'Zkenenu, in our youth and our elders, first published in 1920, where the women of the Ruth Association, which was the first Zionist women's association, are depicted as ignorant women and spinsters, thus describing the wife of one of the characters, Dr. Zilberman. Agnon writes, and I quote, "His wife founded in Shebush and Buchach a women's association named Ruth. In the beginning, all the clowns in Shebush made fun of it, as it was strange that women make for themselves associations. But not long afterwards, the clowns became silent. Not only that their daughters found there a warm corner, but they brought with them their old sisters who had lost hope of getting married, because of their old age and were ashamed to show their faces outside their homes. When winter approached and the night kept getting longer and boredom kept growing, they would get together in the house of wood, end quote. And in another place, in that same satire, in the winter night, we came to our female comrades in the Root Association. Once every other week, the members gave lectures on Jewish history. But since they didn't know the German language, we would read to them the shortened Gretz and explained it, and they made from it lectures in Polish, end quote. According to Agnon, the young women didn't know Hebrew either. As an ardent Zionist, speaking Polish was for Agnon a mark of assimilation, as he writes about the daughter of the Jewish tavern keeper, Uberschenkel, I call the name in this satire. And I'm quoting, at the same time, that is when the mayor was in the tavern, the young Uberschenkel came in. Her face was inflamed like a baker's oven in a year of plenty, and she was holding Wyspiański book Snow in her arm. Wyspiański is a leading Polish nationalist writer of the period, serves here as the symbol of Polish assimilation. In general, the Galician women in this story prepare delicacies for the parties of the young Zionist male, and some compel their parents to purchase for them new dresses for the Zionist balls, knowing full well that the parents can't afford it. Agnon aside, and despite the emphasis on culture and education, the Zionist women organization also served political aims. They created for women a sphere of modern activities that had hitherto been unavailable to them, like campaigning for the Zionist movement and spreading the Zionist message among their members. In its second assembly in 1898, the Zionist World Congress agreed to grant women the right to vote and be elected to its institution, rights that were relatively uncommon at this time. After World War I, with the granting of the franchise to women in the Second Polish Republic, the focus of some women Zionist association changed, especially under the leadership of Rosa Meltzer-Pomeranz. Born in Ternopil in 1873 to a middle-class family, Meltzer-Pomeranz's education included studies in the Royal Conservatory of Music in Leipzig, and her initial association with a Zionist organization was as a piano accompanist for Zionist festivities. In 1908, she founded in Lviv, and it's important for me to give the Ukrainian name, especially where we are now. She founded the Jewish Women's Circle and later the Jewish National Women's Association for Galicia and Bukovina. In 1911, she served as a delegate of the Zionist women in Galicia to the 10th Zionist World Congress in Basel. She was a prolific author, both in German and Polish, of newspaper articles and literary works. In 1922, she was elected to the Polish Sejm, in fact, the only Jewish woman to occupy such a position. It was at this time that she demanded a greater representation of women in the parliament and bemoaned the lack of political opportunities for women. If until the war, Meltzer-Pomeranz identified with the idea that emigration to Palestine was a solution to the problem of Jews and the diaspora, after the war, she focused more on local social work, especially on training young women for better economic opportunities in the diaspora. Moreover, feminist issues of the day now occupied Meltzer-Pomeranz's mind, and her journalistic writing, especially in the Warsaw-based feminist Jewish weekly journal Eva, Tygodnik Weekly, her articles dealt with issues such as women equality in the public sphere and in marriage, birth control, and abortion. Pomeranz supported the establishment by the Polish government of family counseling centers devoted to what we now call family planning. To quote Huchtker, Pomeranz confirmed the modernity of her Zionism with debate about contraception, the protection of women, and demographic arguments. The direction of debates about modernity, apparent from discussion about love, marriage, and sexuality, conveyed a message of traditionality. It was directed at the public in Galicia who were pressured to decide. Those who wanted to be modern had to position themselves accordingly. Modernity, marriage, friendship, and nation constituted each other, end quote. Eva was a Polish language journal that supported Zionism, better say Jewish nationalism, although it was not associated or financed by any specific Zionist group. It was geared for middle-class, secular, Polonized Jewish feminists, assimilationists. In one of her articles, More About Birth Control, 1928, Meltzer-Pomerantz expressed her support for family planning, highlighting health as well as economic issues as justification. This was during the time when the Polish Codification Committee was working on the abortion law, and I included it because of what's going now in Poland and in America. Eugenic and neo-Malthusian ideologies were discussed in the various journals, with Eva generally adopting a radical progressive stance on the issue. As far as I know, Meltzer-Pomerantz didn't publish similar articles in the official Zionist press. Perhaps her position as a female member of the Polish Sejm sensitized her, maybe liberated her, to issues that were on the agenda of contemporary feminists, Polish as well as Jewish. Such a transformation should be included in the discourse on Jewish modernity when applied to Galician women. A gendered perspective of Galician modernity in the field of literature demands a more nuanced attitude. As Hanan Hever had demonstrated in his article, Guru Lachem Agalitzayim, Galician authors were marginalized by figures like Yosef Chaim Brenner in an effort to push them out of the modern Hebrew literary canon. Of course, Hever was referring only to Galician male authors, since there were no significant Galician female authors writing in Hebrew. But there were important female Jewish authors writing in Yiddish, German, and Polish. In recent years, scholars have brought to light several Galician female writers, the most important and famous one being Deborah Vogel. Born to a Polish-speaking middle-class family in Bursztyn, Eastern Galicia in 1902, Vogel studied in a Jewish gymnasium in Lvov and was active in a youth Zionist movement. She received her PhD from the Jagiellonian University in 1926, although she started her studies in Lviv in the philosophy department. I forget the name of the most important philosophy professor there, but it was too difficult for her, and she moved to the Jagiellonian University. Yes, exactly, yes. So, and she was, I don't know how scary figure he was or whatever. While in the past, she first published in Polish and German, but later embraced Yiddish as her literary language. While in the past, Vogel was viewed mainly in the context of a relationship with Bruno Schulz, with a growing academic interest in Yiddish language and literature, it is her Yiddish literary output that is now the focus of scholarly research. Another woman writer, Fradl Stock, born in Skala, again, Eastern Galicia, I'll get to the West in a minute, in 1888, immigrated to America in 1907 and became involved with Yiddish writers there. Some of her short Yiddish stories depicting life of young women in Galicia were published in an English translation in 2022 in a volume titled From the Jewish Provinces Selected Stories. With growing interest in hitherto doubly marginalized writers, Galician female authors writing in Yiddish, we can anticipate the publication of more such translation and studies in the US. But what about Galician Jewish women writers who wrote in Polish and were involved in the Polish literary scene? Such women have been triply marginalized in discussion of Jewish modernity as Galician, female, and Polonized. Yet they deserve to be recognized in such discussion as Jewish authors. At least this is my claim. Especially since a considerable number of Jews, both secular and more traditional, were exposed to Polish culture at different levels. The most productive of the Galician Jewish females who wrote in Polish, and Eugenia, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, pen name Kalas, a writer who is almost unknown outside of Poland, and none of whose work has been translated into English or Hebrew. It is thanks to the work of Eugenia Prokopianiec and Zuzanna Kolodziejska-Smagala that the life and works of Korengut emerged from oblivion. Not surprisingly, unlike Vogel and Stock, Kalas was born in 1869 in Stary Sącz, in western Galicia, a region much more Polonized than the eastern part. The oldest of 4 sisters, we don't know much about her family or her education. She was active as a journalist, novelist, translator, and playwright. Determined to become a successful writer, Korngut knocked on every door possible, establishing contact with famous Polish literary figures like Eliza Orzeszkowa and Gabriela Zapolska. Her works were not dedicated exclusively to Jewish themes, and so her marginalization as a woman writer was apparent also in the non-Jewish Polish literary scene. 2 of Korngut's literary work deal exclusively with issues confronting Jewish women and modernity, both written before World War I. The first one, Our Jewish World, from a friend's diary, appeared in Sambor in 1893, and the second, Prodigal Daughters, that appeared in Lvov in 1913. Both stories reflect the aspiration of young, educated Jewish women and the conflict such aspiration caused with their traditional families. If Yiddish writers such as Stock describe Galician small towns as stuck in the old world and their daughters as just beginning to emerge out of it, Korngut described a more advanced stage of modernity as it applied to young women. In Our Jewish World, an 18-year-old, a graduate of a primary education and a lover of books, is pressured by her loving traditional parents to marry a young man she has no feeling for because her dowry was small and the prospective groom had money. Afraid of causing pain to her mother, this reminds us of Szenier's Polish diary, for those who are familiar with it. She agrees to go ahead with the match, but eventually leaves her husband and gets a divorce. There it's also because of his parents. Korngut seems to be familiar with Jewish religious rituals associated with betrothal and divorce and describe them accurately, like they can't eat the cookies served on the table before the parents say Mazel Tov and agree for the match. She also injects Yiddish words here and there. The story, written as if taken from a friend's diary, has an unhappy ending, alluding that the second marriage of the young woman was not a successful one either. Although the heroine now keeps her unhappiness to herself, marriage outside the traditional Jewish society, and it seems that was her second marriage doesn't necessarily grant happiness to young Jewish feminists. The second story, the novel Prodigal Daughters, which was written about 2 decades later, described a world of young Jewish women in Krakow who aspired for higher education, independence, and equality, including in relation between the sexes. They form a support group, helping each other to meet their goals, and are engaged in heated discussion about Zionism. It's all in that story. I don't know about the aesthetic value of those stories. I'm not a literary scholar, but at least it reflects a certain reality. So there are heated discussions about Zionism, Jewish religious norms and traditions, assimilation, literature, philosophy, love and marriage, etc. The young women in the novel are feminist and ambitious. The main character is embroiled in a deep conflict with her parents, who have no understanding of the life experiences of their daughters, and as I showed in my recent book, is based on the true story of Anna Kluger, a Hasidic daughter who successfully sued her parents to provide for her and her sister a university education. But Korngut doesn't limit herself to describe the emancipation of Jewish women from Orthodox patriarchy. Prodigal Daughters reflect the exploitation of women also by modern educated men, thus highlighting the difficulties of educated Jewish women, especially those who grew up in the old world of traditional society, issues generally ignored by Jewish male writers. Indeed, when discussing Jewish modernity, attendance of Jewish women in Galician universities should be noted. While I don't have data, I wrote it when I was still in the US, didn't have all the books available to me, about attendance. So I don't have data about the attendance of Jewish women at the university in Lviv, but at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, between the academic years 1894-95 and 1917-18, 225 Jewish female students, that is 56.1%, were enrolled in the Faculty of Medicine. Women were accepted to this faculty starting only in 1900. and 500 women, 22.3%, 502 Jewish women. In the philosophy faculty, that's like the humanities, where they were accepted as regular students starting in 1897. Among them were also female students from Congress Poland, since in Imperial Russia, women could not register as regular students before World War I. There were programs for women, but they couldn't participate as regular students. Still, these were impressive numbers, especially when taking into account that Galician Jewish women studied also in Vienna. In the academic year 1913-14, for example, 2.7% of the students in the philosophy faculty there are female students, and 12.2% in the faculty of medicine declared Yiddish as their mother tongue. We can assume that they or their parents came from Galicia. Among the scholarly works on the topic of female Jewish students at the Jagiellonian University are those by Anna Szmiewinska-Pol. She's a doctoral student, for example. She has an article of women with a PhD, not just women, but she mentions a lot of women who left Poland. And many of them were from Galicia, writing dissertation in philosophy, getting jobs outside of Poland, and so on. And of course, we have the more general 1994 Polish book by Ursula Perkowska about female students at the Jagiellonian University. Similar works are not available in English or Hebrew. Since I mentioned the non-depiction of Zionist Women's Association, I want to mention here also Josef Chaim Brenner's depiction of Polish acculturated Jewish women students. In his story, Mikanu Mikan, from here and from there, I guess, published in 1911, Brenner portrays several scenes from Jewish life in Galicia as he himself experienced it a few years beforehand. Brenner makes no attempt to conceal his general contempt for Galician Jews in general, but even more so for its educated women. At the beginning of one of the scenes, Brenner sits on a bench in Lviv, and observes a young Jewish Polish female student inviting friends to accompany her to see a play by Wyspiański, who here too serves as a symbol of assimilation in a Polish theater. Half an hour later, Brenner observes this student again, this time standing in front of the theater building where the anti-Semitic spectacle, I don't know if he means the wedding, since it's more symbolic, I think that's what he means, was advertised on a big red and black poster. Brenner describes the Jewish students' admirers as Jewish and Polish men with trim perfumed black beards and well-groomed haircuts, who the next day will cover the pages of the local newspaper with their glorification of Wyspiański's false vision. Here is the cup, the poison cup, he writes, and proceeds to mark the Polish idiom of the young woman. Proszę pana, proszę pana. This is, he writes it, the story is in Hebrew, but he inserts it in Polish. He feels disconnected from the place to such an extent that he imagines himself as an old Essene of antiquity who has mistakenly wandered into a pagan hippodrome where half-naked female riders gallop to and fro on proud stallions. The Polish acculturated Galician Jewish female student represent for the Russian Zionists, Imperial Russia, I would say, Brenner, a follower of an alien culture, an agent of assimilation. The life experience of such student is not only marginalized by Brenner, but is totally pushed out from any consideration of Jewish modernity. To sum up, expanding the categories for the analysis of Galician Jewish modernity to include categories and terms that apply also to women allows us a gendered perspective, one that gives voice and agency to women as well as to men, even in a society, Jewish and non-Jewish, that excluded women from participating in major spheres of life. The examples I have brought today, Women's National Association and its founders, women writers in Yiddish and Polish, works of literature reflecting the experience of women, the embrace of higher education, the calls for equality in relation between the sexes, and there's a lot of that between men and women that are not married and also in marriage, and the discussion of issues pertaining to women such as contraception and abortion, which becomes a big issue, are some of the topics that can enrich our understanding of Jewish modernity in Galicia. Thank you.